There's a lot going on in the state of Michigan right now. It's kind of hard to keep up with all of it for those of you viewing at home and watching and listening at home, and for us here at the MegaCast too. But someone that is somehow staying up with each and every one of these major stories at the state level is Dave Boucher, government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press, with us today on the MegaCast once again. Dave, thanks for being with us.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Appreciate having you on. So let's start with a recent issue that came up in the Michigan Senate, where a bill was passed by a vote of 20-16 along party lines to ban using the state's public threat alert system for COVID-19 rules and regulations. Governor Whitmer says she plans to veto that. But let's start with the origin of that, because it was presented by party leadership in the Michigan GOP as another measure to undercut Governor Whitmer's approach to COVID-19 communications and to COVID-19 regulations as well. But what really was the purpose, at least as argued by the Michigan GOP, for taking out this really just method of communication that otherwise is not very significant in terms of COVID-19 orders?
Right. So just broadly speaking, early on in the pandemic and a few times in 2020, about 4 times, the state sent out these alerts. You might have gotten it on your cell phone that kind of pop up and say, there's a new order, here's what it says, in relation to masks and the pandemic. The state argued it was a good way to spread information to help, protect people. Republican Bradley Slaw, he's from Zealand, he's in the House. He was the chief sponsor of the bill in the House. This is where this measure originated. And he said that essentially this executive orders and mask mandates aren't an emergency, and so they shouldn't qualify for something that is disseminated using this system. He said overusing the alert system is going to cause people to become numb to legitimate emergencies in the future. Now, we can get into the particulars of the legislation, but arguably the biggest problem here is that the bill is aimed at something called the public threat alert system, and that's not actually what the state used to send out these notifications about COVID measures. So even if this bill passed and the governor let it become law, which she's not going to, she's going to veto it, the state would still have the exact same power to issue the exact same alerts next year, next month, next week. So it's just a piece of legislation that, seemingly, like you said, was another way for Republicans to kind of curtail or attempt to curtail the state's authority when it comes to sharing information about pandemic orders. And it's really, kind of sputtering at this point.
We're joined by Dave Boucher, government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press, with us today on the MegaCast. And Dave, another hot button issue in the state of Michigan over the last several weeks has been whether or not schools should be requiring masks for students, staff, and faculty, particularly in the K through 12 level, but also in higher learning facilities and operations as well. At the state level, are we hearing anything from officials in the legislature or from, certainly we know from Governor Whitmer's office that no further action is planned to be taken. But in terms of the legislature, and I ask this because of their affiliation with the Republican Party that tends to be more so against these mask mandates and these COVID-19 regulations, are we hearing anything from them about opposition legislation potentially to some of these mask mandates that are being put in place by school districts or in most cases by county health departments?
It's kind of in a short, not a ton, right? Because it's kind of it puts, to your point, Republicans who generally oppose these mandates in an interesting position. On one hand, Republican lawmakers tend to advocate for something called local control. So they tend to advocate for, whenever possible, to be able to shift decision-making authority to the entity of government that is closest to the issue. So in this case, in theory, that would be local health departments or local school boards. However, when local health departments or local school boards make decisions that they don't necessarily agree with, they're kind of faced with a decision about whether or not they want to regulate that. So what we've seen has been some statements from Republican lawmakers who have opposed, like you said, some of the local mask mandates and ordinances that have cropped up in Michigan's largest counties. But overall, we have not seen any statewide push to either ban these mask mandates or to institute statewide mask mandates. Now, we at the Free Press and others have focused a lot on the fact that the state health department and the Whitmer administration have the authority to tomorrow enact a statewide mask mandate for K through 12 schools. The governor thought that that was an important thing to do in September of last year. As of today, even with vaccines, essentially all of the COVID trends are worse than they were in September of last year when she instituted that. However, the governor and the Director Hertel, the head of the health department, have focused on this idea of urging counties to institute mask mandates. A couple of large counties like Wayne County instituted a mask mandate. Washtenaw County instituted a mask mandate this week. It puts the number of students that are under this mask mandate above 50% in the state. But there are still literally hundreds of thousands of students who are not eligible to get a vaccine and are still going to schools where mask mandates are not enforced.
Roughly about 60% of Michigan's K through 12 students are under a mask mandate after the addition of Washtenaw County and Ingham County recently putting their mask mandates in place. And in terms of Governor Whitmer and her administration and their approach to COVID-19 rules and regulations and precautions being put in place, they've really flipped the script from a year ago, from certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, where they were taking this action, and really evasive action in some cases, before it was maybe necessary, before it was maybe urgent, but definitely when it was necessary. And now they've sort of taken a hands-off approach. And there's been a lot of questions about why that's come up, and certainly there's a lot of speculation that it's election related, because the governor has certainly taken a lot of flack over the last year and a half plus during this pandemic for some of her actions regarding COVID-19 and on other issues as well. Is there any indication other than maybe something political from the governor's office? Is there any indication as to why this change of heart happened seemingly so suddenly and so different? It really is a flipping of the script from her previous doctrine on these issues.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that, as you noted, some of these pandemic orders came out right in the beginning of the pandemic and really in the fall. The governor's office and the administration at large would say that a lot of those orders were happening, obviously, before there was broad access to a vaccine. And so the state argued that without this, potentially life-saving measure, that the state needed to enact other safety mitigations like gathering restrictions, mask restrictions, social distancing requirements in order to keep people healthy. After vaccines started becoming more accessible, and after former Health Department Director Robert Gordon resigned, we saw just a pretty steady rescinding of those health orders, and the governor has started to preach more personal responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean that the state hasn't, strongly encouraged vaccinations, mask wearing. The governor is in favor of private businesses instituting mask and vaccine requirements. She obviously supports school districts enacting mask regulations, but she has kind of stepped back. Obviously, I've heard the same arguments that you have about political expediency. I think Republicans are trying to have their cake and eat it too a little bit on this, right? Like, they're saying that the governor is acting politically, but she's also doing what they want her to do, which is to not enact any mask mandates. So that's kind of like a double-edged sword. I don't know if she's acting, with political expediency or not. I think it is completely fair to question why she thinks a mask mandate is paramount to save children, and that her administration has the power to enact that mask mandate, but it's more important for local health departments and local school districts to make that decision than for her health department to do so.
We're joined by Dave Boucher. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press with us today on the MegaCast. And Dave, we had a report this week that Michigan is sending first responders to Louisiana to help with the Hurricane Ida rescue efforts. And that brings up, and especially as we've seen, certainly a lot of flooding in areas like in Newark earlier this week, and definitely down south in Louisiana, where there has been extreme damage. And our thoughts are definitely with the people of Louisiana and Mississippi and those down south who were directly hit by Hurricane Ida at its Category 4 stage in its progression. Here in Michigan, it brings up a similar topic that we've seen be a point of issue over the summer, which is the flooding that we've experienced here, particularly downriver near the city of Detroit, near Dearborn Heights. The Grosse Points certainly have been impacted by that as well. And the issue of infrastructure in the state of Michigan, especially with all the COVID-19 relief funds that are coming in from the federal level and that will be distributed at the state level. What discussions are there, if any, from the state legislature, from the governor's office, about addressing the issues of infrastructure, particularly in those commonly affected areas, in addition to, of course, what is also a consideration in this, which is climate change?
Yeah, so as you noted, broadly speaking, we've heard from the governor and from state lawmakers about the concept of the need for infrastructure investment, right? But that's not necessarily something that is unique after this round of flooding. I mean, that was essentially the hallmark of the governor's 2018 campaign, the Fix the Damn Road slogan that became super popular. I mean, that's not just potholes, right? That's the whole concept of infrastructure and kind of the necessity to invest in it. To some degree, how local jurisdictions use that COVID funds is up to local jurisdictions. Broadly speaking, the governor and state lawmakers are and have, worked to distribute funding to local jurisdictions. That is, as you said, federal COVID relief funding. So there are billions of dollars that are going to local municipalities, and those municipalities, to some degree, are deciding how they want to use it. In theory, those funds are supposed to help mitigate the losses from the pandemic. In practice, we'll see how much of that is dedicated to, critical infrastructure investment versus any number of other issues that, a city like Detroit or Dearborn, as you said, might want to address with that funding.
We're joined by Dave Boucher with us on the MegaCast. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. And Dave, we are heading into election season. We've seen a number of people already declare their candidacy or announce that they plan to run for the governorship against Governor Whitmer, most notably that being former Detroit Police Chief James Craig and his campaign. As we head into this campaign season, especially after the given year that and what has happened with COVID-19, and certainly the hit that the governor has taken over the past year, what really is the focus of the Michigan GOP as they plan to eventually down the line here put a competitor against Governor Whitmer? And then certainly with James Craig, he's got the notoriety, he's got the recognition in the city of Detroit, but what other considerations are they really taking into as far as who they're looking for in a candidate to go up against Governor Whitmer and potentially unseat her from the governorship?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's unresolved. We and many others have reported this many times. The Republican Party is not a monolith, just like Democrats and any other voting bloc is. They're all comprised of unique individuals who have their own ideas. And just as is the case many times after an election where Republicans, lost at a national level, there's infighting and there's soul searching. There's been just a ton of reporting on this kind of like ongoing battle between so-called establishment Republicans or never Trumper Republicans versus the people who in the party who are adamant Trump supporters, and kind of, what that conflict means. There was some really good reporting this week today from the Detroit News that looked at a conflict at a local GOP meeting between Matt DePerno, who is an attorney. He's running for the Attorney General nomination for the Republican Party. He's also spread conspiracy theories and misinformation about the election in Antrim County. He spoke at a local GOP meeting and essentially accused Republican lawmakers of being complicit in the death of Marines in Afghanistan because they didn't work to decertify and overturn the election results in Michigan. And that didn't sit well with Republican lawmakers at the meeting, some of whom used expletives to respond to some of those comments from DePerno. So, and that's just one story. We've heard many others about some of the infighting. I think in general, the one unifying force, which might seem obvious, is that everybody just wants to beat Gretchen Whitmer. I think to some degree that's comparable to the unifying force that brought Republicans together to win the 2016 election against Hillary Clinton. Everybody in the Republican Party and many others agreed that they didn't want Hillary Clinton to be president. But beyond that, there weren't a ton of unifying issues that brought together candidates. That's why we saw 19 candidates or 20 candidates, and that Donald Trump went from somebody that nobody thought could win or lots of people didn't think could win to the front runner very, very quickly. So as you pointed out, James Craig is a name that people are familiar with, at least in Detroit. I think it's fair to question whether or not people in Grand Rapids, Traverse City, Midland, Alpena know who James Craig is. Whereas there are other, candidates who are running and continue to raise money. So it's a long process, and, we'll see who emerges.
We're joined by Dave Boucher, government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press today on the MegaCast. Dave, just another couple minutes before we'll say goodbye for this week. And before I let you go, any other stories right now or any other issues that the people of Michigan should be keeping an eye out for more stories on or should be interested in or maybe interested in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, so the big story for me this week, we put out a couple stories this morning, were about the impact of the Supreme Court's decision on the Texas abortion law in Michigan and what that would mean for Michigan. And so if people didn't know, Texas passed a law recently that said essentially all abortions after 6 weeks are illegal, and anyone in the country has standing to sue anyone in Texas who might have violated this law. The Supreme Court, at least initially, decided not to intervene and to not prevent that law from taking effect. Many people consider this essentially a de facto overturning of Roe v. Wade. So I explored this week what it would look like in Michigan if Roe v. Wade were overturned and kind of the state of abortion in Michigan. In Michigan, there's still a law on the books that makes most abortions a felony. It's from 1931. It says any abortion that is performed that is not done so to save the life of the mother is illegal. However, Roe v. Wade supersedes that law, right? So there's a question about if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, which many expect could happen as soon as this coming June, does that mean that this 1931 law takes effect? And even if it takes effect, what does enforcement look like? Attorney General Dana Nessel has said that she would never prosecute a woman who sought an abortion. Eli Savitt, the prosecuting attorney in Washington County, said the exact same thing yesterday. In theory, that creates something of a patchwork system where abortions are prosecuted in some counties, but not in other counties in Michigan. They're prosecuted in some states across the country, but not in other states in the country. And so that's an issue that I think a lot of people are going to continue to watch. It's an issue that could elicit initiative petitions. It already has in the past. And so that's one that obviously is something that really drives voter interest and will continue to do so this year and next year.
Well, Dave, we appreciate your time and thank you for being with us today.
Of course. Thank you.